Is the old school revival just a form of the baby duck syndrome? Welcome to my channel. I focus on tabletop role-playing games, video games, and science fiction. In 1987, Dr. Dobb's journal, which was at the time a very impressive and well-read and well-respected magazine about computer programming, published an article called Text Editors, the Baby Duck Syndrome. And the argument is just like a baby duck impresses on the first thing it sees and thinks that whatever it first sees is its mother, that people, when they first learn to program, the first text editor that they do, they think is the perfect text editor. And nothing will match that. That's why you get some of the religious wars about the difference between VI and Emacs. Just as an aside, I'm an Emacs fan, but that's it. Those are all computer things. But I'm talking about role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons and other role-playing games. So the first one I learned was Dungeons and Dragons, and I understand. I have the baby duck syndrome. I look, they call me a grognard because I think I like the original, not even the first edition. I have problems with the first edition. I like the original much better than many of the others for various reasons. And that part of that I recognize is the baby duck syndrome because it was the first one I learned. There are other systems. I've played Tunnels and Trolls. I've done Traveler. I've done a variety of other systems. Those are probably the most popular ones that people have. I mentioned the Morrow Project and some others that I have played in the past. And TSR, which now is part of Wizards of the Coast, or which is part of Hasbro, have always had the major share that I've played with. Now, I never got into Pathfinder because I'd always sort of stuck with Dungeons and Dragons and TSR and whatever they became. So, and the reason that I made the decision to stay with them is because of popularity. Now, I know at one point in time Pathfinder may have been more popular than Dungeons and Dragons, but Dungeons and Dragons has always been very popular. At least, you've always been able to find people who would play Dungeons and Dragons. And it's like, it's the least offensive game system that most people are familiar with. They may not like it, they may have complaints about it, but what happens is that many people know you can find other people to play with, other dungeon masters. You pick up something that's quite a bit more obscure, and it may be hard to find players. But the issue is it the baby duck syndrome, that the first text editor that you learn is the editor that you prefer for the rest of your life? Now, for me, Emacs was not the first text editor I learned. I grew up, the first one I probably learned was called the P system, which is truly obscure today. Anyway, I made a decision early on in my career that I wanted to have an editor that I could use anywhere and everywhere, and I knew that Emacs was going to be everywhere that I ever wanted to work. So I made the decision as a personal choice to learn Emacs, because I knew it was going to be available on PC. It was available on everything, every platform that is out there. It was actually even available on my phone. So it's literally portable. But it's keystrokes most people don't know. And it's an obscure thing there. But for me, I'm very productive with it. And I've actually had people who watched me say, what editor are you using and how did you, but I've been doing it for a long time. And the same thing is true with game mastering and running adventures. Now, I run Dungeons and Dragons because it's not offensive. I mean, there are things about the rules some of the things that I dislike, but I can live with them. I remember dealing with the 4th edition, and I really dislike the 4th edition. Like, people don't realize just how much I despise the 4th edition of Dungeons and Dragons, but I ran it because I knew I could find other players. And I look at this old school rules and I go, isn't this just a throwback to the same thing, the baby duck syndrome? Because most of the people who started this are a little bit older. Maybe not even as old as I am, but they're a little bit older, and they probably started learning with an earlier version of Dungeons and Dragons. And that was probably one of the first. I know there's going to be exceptions and things like that, but it's the interesting question are the people who are such strong proponents of old school rules, is it just an outgrowth of that's the first rule set that you learned, rather than based upon the merits of a rule system? Because there are other rule systems that can be either simpler, more complex, and so on. I've looked at other rule systems. I spent a lot of time going through like Savage Worlds. And one of the problems I have with Savage Worlds, and I'll just be clear with that, is I tend to play online more and more frequently, and I don't like virtual tabletops. That's a whole nother discussion. But Savage Worlds is written around this concept of using a deck of cards, which is a bit of a problem unless in essence, you need a lot more support than just a set of dice. Because you need to share the deck of cards, which is the challenge. In normal games like Dungeons and Dragons, I trust the players to roll the die roll. They can roll their own dice. Actually, prefer them to roll their own dice and tell me what it is. I trust them not to cheat. That's a matter of trust. But with the Savage Worlds, one of the mechanics is this deck of cards, and I understand it's interesting when you're playing in person, but when you're playing online, that's one of the things that keeps me away from Savage Worlds. And I've seen some other things, but that was built into the mechanic of that. And the same thing is with like Fate and with Fudge. The problem I had with it was that you had to either have special dice or figure out the rules. It just didn't attract me to that. But it's the old school rules, and the way I tend to play doesn't really matter. I tend to Dungeon Master, and I think I've mentioned this before, the best adventures I've had is where no one's rolled any dice. Yes, an entire adventure where no one has rolled any dice, and you're playing Dungeons and Dragons with the Dungeons and Dragons rules, which means you're interacting with non-player characters throughout, and nothing is by chance, really. So those are the interesting kind of games that I enjoy running and playing in. So maybe the DMs rolled some dice, but it wasn't that truly obvious. I didn't have to do any saving throws or something like it, or it fit so it was so smoothly integrated that it didn't interact and didn't delay. You didn't have this combat that lasted for hours, it seems like, which I ran into with the 4th edition, which is one of the reasons why I disliked it. The combat was so terribly slow. So my question is if you really take a look at the games you like to play, that the role-playing games that you are playing, that you enjoy now, and ask yourself the question, how is that the same game that you first learned? Or how similar to the first game that you learned is that? Is that just a variant of the first game that you learned? Have you truly embraced something radically different from what you first learned? And basically the question I'm asking, are you suffering from the baby duck syndrome with regard to your choices in the role-playing games you play? Now, I'd like to hear your comments on that. I know, I admit, I suffer from or enjoy the baby duck syndrome for my role-playing games. I stick with Dungeons and Dragons. I can find players. I can find DMs. That for me, that's easy. That's one of the rules of thumb that I have, is that it's not a system that's so obscure that I can't find players. But it's also compatible with what I first learned. And so I understand that, and I always have a difficulty with completely wildly different rules. They're interesting to read, they're interesting to study, but playing them is the more interesting question. What's your comfort level with a completely different set of rules? What is your comfort level with something that that you had? Did you learn to hate Dungeons and Dragons and never want to play it again? Did it leave a bad taste in your mouth? Tell me about it in your comments below. Do you think you're suffering from baby duck syndrome, or did you consciously decide to learn a different system and go from there? And what does this say about this old school revival? It's sort of an interesting question. Are people just reliving their childhood? So let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching my video. I look forward to learning what you think about this video. Let me know in the comments below. If you like the video, press the thumbs up button. You can subscribe by clicking the link in the lower left. If you are interested, there are links to more content.